Okay, I think it's good. So whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. I'm just getting sorted, but I'm really excited to give this talk. It's called So Writing Tests Feel Painful, What Now? And I did give it a couple of weeks ago at RailsConf in Detroit, but I'm really excited to be able to give it to folks here. All right, we're just gonna get started. I learned recently about something called the Stages of Change model, which describes how people navigate making a significant decision or change in behavior in their lives. And I suspect that my talk maybe intrigued you because you are somewhere around here in this blob when it comes to testing. So in the contemplation stage, you are considering making a change, but you might not know how you'll go about it. In the determination stage, you are ready to take an action, maybe starting with some small approachable steps. And if you are indeed somewhere, in these stages, that is very great for me because that means that I have the best possible opportunity today to help you move forward from where you're at. So I know a lot of people struggle with testing and they are not really sure what to do about it. As a consultant, I embed in client teams dealing with complexity in their day-to-day work, and it shows in their tests. The following might sound familiar. You try to read or write a test and then get lost along the way. You find yourself bogged down brute forcing a test to green. First of all, that makes sense that it's painful, especially if you work in a large and complicated code base. And if you're already a pro at this, this talk can still be for you. I think we would all be wise to understand and empathize with the experiences of our fellow colleagues. So what if I told you that you already have a tool for determining the next step when you have some testing struggle? Our instincts are very wise, and we would do well to become more skilled in listening to them. So my goal for this talk is not to provide prescriptions, but to teach you how you can explore your own process for approaching a tricky test. And today we'll work through an example realistic to many modern Rails apps that I've seen. We'll articulate some reactions provoked by code, learn how to adapt to them, and then make space to experiment with change. So I would like us to imagine that we're building an app called Patreon. It's like Patreon, but for pets. And it's a platform for people to financially support their favorite pets in exchange for various membership perks. This is my dog, Hickory. He has a page on Patreon to cultivate a community of people who want to give him love, affection, and treats. You can join the Hickory fan club on a certain tier, each of which has different membership benefits. A reasonable $5 a month gives you access to exclusive album of cute pictures of him, or you can go wild on the $100 tier, and I will personally cook him a steak dinner and let you FaceTime him monthly because why not? And since I clearly know what the users want, I've also built some functionality to let Hickory fans to try out benefits before committing. You can upgrade tiers on a trial basis. So this happens via a class called Tier with Trial Upgrader, which accepts a membership and a tier in its initializer. And it has one public instance method called upgrade, which starts the trial and updates the membership tier. There's also some conditional logic. So let's say if the membership was already on a subscription-based billing model, it would update the subscription with the trial information as well. And this is perfectly serviceable code if you catch my drift. In many Rails apps I've seen, classes like these often orchestrate procedural work. Maybe it logs an event or enqueues some additional work in a background job. So just business logic, as some would call it. But later it turns out that subscription-based members are upset because they didn't receive proper notification about their trial. They want to know when they'll be billed next. So we find ourselves looking at this condition for if they have a paid subscription. And let's say we have already implemented some other class called subscription notifier, which has a class method named notify trial started. And it takes in a subscription, which we can presume was defined elsewhere in the file. And we have access to that trial variable from earlier in the method. And since we introduced new behavior, we'd like to write a test for it. For this talk, we are using RSpec Rails and Factory Bot as part of our testing toolkit. So we navigate to the spec file, and hooray, there's an existing test for this upgrade method, and even the particular condition that we are targeting. Except it looks like this, and I find it pretty overwhelming, so I don't even want you to bother making too much sense of the slide. So let me tell you what I experience when I look at that code. First, I want to make a noise like, because I don't know what to focus on. I'm surprised to see some class names of collaborators that we didn't notice at first glance in the application code that we were looking at earlier. And there's also some arbitrary values in test data that I'm confused whether that's important or not. So I enumerate these feelings because once I do, I tend to be able to observe them with less attachment. I'm able to step into a bit more curiosity about what's going on rather than kind of flail around in my grievances, because I've certainly been there. And if you've heard of code smells, they are hints that something may be off about the design of our code, regardless of the code working or even passing a test. And I would say that developing a nose for code smells takes practice. But the cool thing is that we already have an instrument to pay attention to, which is our own state of being. So do you remember my surprise about seeing additional collaborators? It turns out that these two methods that I've highlighted actually obscure some implicit dependencies. Subscription is a memoized instance of the class Stripe subscription, which takes in the membership. And then when we call this update subscription method, we are calling this update method on the subscription itself, which takes in all these other arguments, including the tiers that it's moving to and from, as well as the end date of the trial. And I don't know why, but this is just kind of what we're dealing with. Anyone who works with legacy or existing code kind of knows that, just why is this like this feeling? So we can presume, we also want to look at this start trial method, and we find out that we call the start class method on the trial model, which we presume returns an instance of the trial that was started. So what now? Our goal was to test the new behavior that we added for that notifier, but the existing test was so difficult to read, and I imagine difficult to write. And we had to dip into details of private methods to understand what was happening. When you write a test, you are interacting with the code as a user. It's said that if testing feels painful, we might want to reconsider the design of our code. And to me, that begs the question, what are tests for? So, we often know them as verifying behavior and catching bugs, but if they give us grief and we don't know why, I think there is a bit of a mindset shift in order. And I'm of the opinion that we should write tests for ourselves and for each other, not just for a green check mark. A good test tells you how the system works, how to use methods available to you, what to put in and expect out, and potentially any side effects that happen along the way. So I like to think of it as leaving a torch in a dark tunnel. We pay it forward when we write tests with the intention that others will rely on them, including our future selves. So we find ourselves a little bit lost in this dark tunnel in the tier with trial upgrader class. We're a bit uncertain, and that's okay. It's not anyone's fault. And what matters is kind of what we choose to do next and how we find our footing. So the main feeling I want to resolve is that overwhelm. And I kind of start asking myself, like, what would help to ground myself in this test file? And maybe I might start reorganizing information in the test. So I could co-locate behavior by inlining some references or definitions that are defined kind of far away, either like in another file or just at the top of the file in some let blocks, or maybe at the bottom if it's like a helper method in the test file. I maybe will flatten or nest some like context blocks, depending if I need to just like situate the context around the different conditions being tested, so that I'm able to see everything in front of me. But in this case, I actually want to start with a clean slate and write the test from scratch, even though there's already an existing test for this code path. This helps me not be biased by what was written previously, because it's our test now and we can do whatever we'd like with it. You may feel nervous to write a totally new test for existing code, and that's okay. That could mean that you need some more information before getting started. Common sense tells us to get directions before heading off into the unknown. So I suggest asking yourself a couple of questions to get that guidance. So do you know what you're testing? Do you know how to set up the object method under test? Do you know how to get into the appropriate code path? If not, maybe there's a bit more work ahead of you. But once I've gotten my bearings, I follow the arrange, act, assert pattern for organizing my tests, which helps me keep track of where we've been and what we still need to do. And sometimes I begin at the end with the assertion because that's information we have at hand since we already wrote it in the test description. So because I would like to verify the behavior of notifying here, since it's a side effect and we don't really have an accessible state to assert on, we mock subscription notifier and expect it to have received our method notify trial started. And next, we want to fill in the act part of our pattern. So we construct the instance of a tier with upgrader trial to call the upgrade method on. And it needs a membership and a tier, which we don't have yet. So we provide those two arguments by setting them up with FactoryBot. And since we want to enter that condition for when a membership has a subscription, we set the has paid subscription attribute to true. Lately, I've also been finding it helpful to think about necessary versus unnecessary coupling in test. So coupling is the degree to which things need to change together. And if you've heard about it, you might have heard that it's something to avoid because it's kind of said that loosely coupled modular software is easier to work with and change. But I do want to point out that some amount of coupling is expected in test code because we need some entry point into our system, right? So considering the minimum dependencies required for a test kind of primes me to notice when that coupling starts to spiral a bit and we are kind of dealing with more things than we think we might need to. And I think we would benefit from kind of taking a look at where we're at now with our coupling. So first of all, we are coupled to the class and method under test, and luckily upgrade doesn't accept any other arguments, so we don't have to worry about creating additional objects there. But we do have to know about the arguments to new up that class and any details for configuring them. And then lastly, the class responsible for the side effect, because that's what we're asserting on. And for now, that all seems pretty reasonable to me. However, we want to ensure that notify trial started is sent with the correct subscription and trial, not just any. So here we are using RSpec's with method to constrain our expectation. But now we have a problem. How do we specify these arguments that we want to match on when we don't have access to subscription or trial in our test code? Because remember, subscription comes from this private method. So we instantiate a subscription in the test, and in order to make an assertion on it, we unfortunately need to stripe subscription's new method to return it. And so our test kind of starts to look like this. It grew a couple of lines. And I feel somewhat uneasy about the RSpec wizardry that we had to do to stub the subscription. I want to make note of that feeling, but for now we'll move on because we still need to set up a trial. And if you'll recall, a trial is returned by this class method on start called start. So we build a trial with the factory, and again, we need to stub a class method in order to verify that the trial returned by start does indeed get passed into our notifier. And so this is where I begin to juggle a few too many things in my head. But we are so close. We are ready to run our test. So we do that, and it fails spectacularly. So why that big scary block of red? It turns out that following the path to update a subscription makes a request to that Stripe API, and that failure can manifest in a couple different ways. You might see an error related to Stripe itself. If your app uses a library called webmock, it will complain about making external network requests that you didn't stub previously. Or worst case, like what we saw just now, we'll get some obtuse nil class exception because the code is just so brittle that you simply can't run the test in isolation despite setting up everything referenced in the class. So fine, we don't want to bother with subscription actually executing its update method that eventually calls the API. So we plug that up here with another allow statement. And now, if you can believe it, we finally arrived at a green test. But honestly, at this point, I am pretty mad because that sucked. And I've lost a lot of my steam. When I'm in this mood, like my pessimism just blocks like any kind of critical thinking that I might be able to have. So when I try to push through, I know I do worse work because I would like to be interacting with the code, from like a calm sense of state rather than frustration and just getting the thing to work. So now is an excellent time to take a break and grab a snack and pet my dog. I don't know, just look at this guy. Don't you want to join his Patreon? Anyway, so we come back to the test in its full glory, after a bit of a break, and it's passing, which is awesome. And so we can take a moment to celebrate what we've accomplished thus far. So in testing the notify trial started method, and that it was invoked with the correct arguments, we made explicit the data needed for the method under test. We unearthed some coupling to Stripe via the subscription, and we learned how trials are started. So there's a book that I read and loved kind of in preparation for this talk, and it's called Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers. And in it, he introduces this concept called a characterization test. When writing tests for code you don't understand, the goal is not to figure out what it should do, but what it actually does. So testing no longer is this like moral authority, but just a tool for gathering information. And I really like this framing because it encourages discovery as the primary goal. Even though we had some existing coverage, writing the test from scratch illuminated a lot of things about our code, whether we liked finding that out or not. But that brings me to my next point, which is to move at the speed of trust in your tests. Because if you don't have trustworthy tests, it's not surprising to me that kind of that fear of change lurks in every file. And it's not enough for tests just to fail if you don't understand why they broke. So that's why I take the time to care for and restore tests. It's the quickest and safest way to observe the behavior of our application. So now that I'm no longer as overwhelmed by that existing test, because I know exactly what I wrote here, I'm more clued into some other types of friction. So let's say I start to like have to scroll up and down a lot in this test file to navigate it. That's kind of annoying. And that clues me into what started as a few lines, like 5 or so lines at the beginning, is actually, taking up a lot of real estate. So in other words, this class has grown a lot of additional responsibilities that it might not be suited for when it was originally written. The upgrade method now has to start a trial. It has to determine if a membership has a subscription. It has to instantiate the subscription, update it, send the notification, and then update the membership also. And so writing out responsibilities of classes and methods like this can just be in a code comment or like on a post-it if you like analog. This is a technique commonly used in domain-driven design. And I find it really useful when I need to make sense of existing code. And with that awareness of all the things that it's doing, I don't love this change because it was already managing many tasks and I just added to it. I mean, I think most of us have been there. But experience tells me that code like that only attracts more responsibilities, right? You see all the things that started doing and you're like, oh, like, what's one more thing? But, now that I like have looked at it and sat with it, I'm just like, ugh, is there anything I can do here? I'm not totally keen on just merging it because there is some aspect of thinking like maybe my work's not complete. Especially because we've built up all this knowledge about how the code works. And I want to make sure that it's put to good use. We spent all that time learning about the stuff that was hidden to us. And so for me, that's kind of a cue to seek out opportunities for improvement. And with our trusty test in place, we can actually start to practice refactoring with safety. So here's what our test descriptions currently look like. Their setups ended up being quite similar. And now is a great time to ask, like, why does that duplication exist? In a previous life before I was a dev, I went to journalism school where I learned the value of brevity. So I often find myself noticing redundancy. And I've actually highlighted all the instances of the words subscription and trial here because I think usually with that redundancy, there's perhaps like a missing connection. Maybe there's some operations that need to happen together. And I also want to follow up on that awkwardness that I had mentioned earlier from allowing all of these messages, because by doing this, we kind of wave a magic wand over these methods so that they're not actually exercised. And when these allowances make up the bulk of my test, I start to get a little dubious because, how do I know that my code actually is integrated properly when I've allowed all these shortcuts in my test? And that feeling should nudge you towards a more focused unit test. And I chose an example with excessive stubbing because I think it's a common cause of test pain. And there is a different style of testing that you might be familiar with that involves more about creating all the objects necessary to exercise the code fully. So rather than stubbing that update method on the subscription that called the Stripe API, we also could have set up more collaborators needed until we reached that boundary of the application. But I think in general, having to create many objects, and likely they're also creating records in the test database, is a symptom of the same problem. So while we are taking a bit of a different approach by stubbing here, I think being a bit wary of mystery guests that show up to the party is also a good kind of feeling to just pay attention to. So that doubt that I mentioned about things being plumbed kind of correctly turns my attention to this condition, because that is where we had to add some additional allow statements. And I think it's kind of surprising how these mere 2 lines just generated so much more in the test. And kind of to figure out what to do about that, I ended up inlining the update subscription method like so, because now I can see more clearly what all is involved. And my eye catches on how we're exposing that tier name method on the subscription, because this would be available from inside the instance method update. And that kind of brings me to my next discrete piece of advice, which is if you start to get lost or distracted by a bunch of method calls, that's a signal. There might just be simply like too much information for your brain to hold. It's not because you can't figure out what's going on. I made a point earlier to keep an eye on that extraneous coupling, and this is what I'm talking about. The failing test we saw earlier also reinforced this concern. We found ourselves very deep in the guts of dealing with the shape of Stripe's subscription API, and I know a rabbit hole when I see one. So this code not only leaks details about subscription, but as you can see, we're also calling these extra methods on tier and trial also that we now have to know about a little more, or start to maybe distract us from what this class is actually doing. And so with all that laid out in front of me, I wonder, like, is there a meaning hidden here for me to discern? Is there a way to distill that information into a single idea? And many people associate redundancy with applying dry, the dry principle, do not repeat yourself. But I find that rule quite lacking in nuance. The point isn't just to remove duplication, but it requires like sitting with the ambiguity until you're able to express the truest and most precise abstraction with your code. And I think anything less risks obfuscating meaning, like we saw earlier. And to be clear, this is very hard and it takes a lot of time. I often like to pair with someone to talk it through because it's a very like creative and generative task, I think. So I like someone else to just kind of to riff on it or be like, do you have any naming ideas for this? And it also helps develop a common language for the code that we're working on together, which is just critical to sharing knowledge across the team, because we should be able to work on code in an application written by someone else and kind of understand what's going on. And again, not because you can't figure it out. That's not what should be hard. I think it's figuring out what the code actually means or is wanting to tell us. And that is part of the work that, that we need to be doing. So after giving it a think, I landed on encapsulating the two responsibilities in a new method. We sprouted the idea of updating a subscription specifically in the context of a trial. And we wrapped it with the intention of notifying. So that's why I've created this new method called notified update with trial. And this is another strategy I like from working effectively with legacy code. Wrapping methods lets us add new functionality to existing ones without modifying those existing methods. And we've also introduced a new seam. A seam is a place that enables behavior to change. The one we've made here separates the class responsible for orchestrating all the things that needs to happen in an upgrade with the mechanisms of actually how the upgrade works. And then our seam dovetails really nicely with another guideline called tell, don't ask. So previously the code exposed information about the tier, subscription, and notifier when it came to the arguments that we were passing in. And so now instead of querying for those details in the tier with upgrade or trial class, we simply tell the subscription to do a notified update, and those details get kind of encapsulated there, so we don't have to like have that mental overhead of trying to be like, oh, what are all these other kind of method calls happening, and do I need to care about them? And the best part is that we can basically move our existing test into the spec file for Stripe subscription with a few minor adjustments. And that leaves us with only one test needed for that condition in tier with trial upgrader, as well as getting rid of 2 of those allow statements to stub our code. And I think that's an improvement. And this is kind of where we stop for now. I've been sitting with this example for now 2 months, and I still see areas for improvement, but perfect is the enemy of good. And, that's a task for another day. So this is what the method looks like now. You might be thinking that was a whole lot of effort for it to look almost exactly the same. Was it worth it? I think so. The only way to deal with complexity is to manage it. And now we've created an affordance for this emerging concept related to a subscription. And we prevented this class from growing another line, another responsibility. So we didn't add another thing to that post-it note. And we learned a lot. We learned a lot. And that is incredibly valuable. We documented those learnings as collective wisdom in our tests for our team and ourselves. Building up that knowledge is crucial because I think that's just what's required in order to shape change with creativity and clarity, is just really looking at what you're dealing with. Michael Feather says the biggest obstacle to improvement in large code bases is the existing code, but I'm not talking about how hard it is to work in difficult code. I'm talking about what that code leads you to believe. So code is constantly provoking reactions in us, and it doesn't even need to be old code. It can be code you wrote like 10 minutes ago. How we feel when we write tests is one of the quickest feedback loops that we have about the quality of our system. So if we ignore or numb ourselves to that pain, we end up losing faith in our work, I think. Or worse, we are told to do a dreaded rewrite. And we need to find better ways of coping, because that test pain matters. Can you figure out what you need to do right now to tend to it? It doesn't even need to be a sweeping refactor. You know, it's just even building up that knowledge and finding a little bit of like a foothold to grab onto. Small actions like that do add up. And that's important, so we can continue obviously doing the good work of connecting pets and pet lovers on our very viable and profitable product, Petria. And to call back to the stages of change model from the beginning, I would be thrilled if I were able to help you move, a little bit forward on it towards determination and action, in harnessing the power of your tests. And if you're ready to dive deeper, I learned, referenced, and found inspiration from lots and lots of resources for this talk. So you can check a lot of these out if you want. And then I talked a little bit today about design patterns and heuristics, some of which you may have heard before. And I wanted to share a cool tidbit I learned, which is that object-oriented programming picked up the idea of design patterns from the art and science of architecture. So specifically the work of an architect named Christopher Alexander, and he has a book called The Timeless Way of Building, where he theorizes why patterns work so well for us. And he claims that they invoke a quality without a name. And he illustrates this by distinguishing the design of a courtyard that feels alive versus dead. So a living courtyard is one that supports life by enabling our natural walking patterns, connecting to open space with a view. It just feels good to be in. And in contrast, a dead courtyard is one whose design fails to provide for the needs of human beings. So it might be totally enclosed or have no shade. It's uninviting, and as a result, becomes abandoned because no one actually wants to spend time in it. And our human intuition can tell the difference when we inhabit these spaces, right? I'm sure you all know that feeling when you, just enjoy being in the world in a very well architected or designed space. And I would even say that the same is true of the code that we work in. The tech industry loves being data-driven, but I actually find a lot of inspiration in remembering the purpose of things like best practices. And I think it lies beyond what's clean or superior. And it's something that no algorithm can quite capture because, as Donella Meadows says, pretending that something doesn't exist, even if it's hard to quantify, leads to faulty models. Human beings have been endowed not only with the ability to count, but also with the ability to assess quality. So I would love to not lose sight of that quality without a name, which is how we feel about our software. And since you're already writing a test, you can ask yourself what you need to find some peace and ease in that work, and then make it so. I'm Stephanie Minn. I work at a consultancy called Thoughtbot. You can hire us to help your team write joyful and maintainable tests if that is something that your team is struggling with. I host a podcast weekly about software development called Bike Shed. And yeah, that's that's it for me. Thanks. Hickory says thanks too. Happy to answer questions. Yeah, okay. I am wrapping up now.